Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I'll never forget the night last year when I realized I was being stalked and watched the entire walk home from work by a strange man who had approached me earlier that same day. My skin still crawls remembering how stealthily he tracked my every move all evening long, only to disappear when I finally spotted him, leaving me constantly looking over my shoulder in lingering fear. It started off as a normal, gloomy Thursday evening closing up the boutique shop where I worked. With payday coming the next day, I decided to stop at the Walmart just down the block on my way home to pick up some groceries so I could relax and unwind over the upcoming weekend. The massive store was bustling with the usual after-work rush of people stopping in to grab necessities on their way home for the night. I quickly found the few items I needed and headed to the produce section. As I was examining some tomatoes, the man who looked to be around my age suddenly approached me with a smile. He asked if I knew which variety of apples were best for baking pies. Taken slightly aback, I politely pointed him towards some good baking options and then turned away, hoping he would take the hint that I wasn't interested in engaging with a stranger. I just wanted to grab my last few things quickly and get home before it got too dark out. But to my annoyance, he seemed completely oblivious to my signals of disinterest. Each new aisle I went down, he managed to mysteriously pop up again, pretending to need my opinion or assistance on some nearby item. At first, it just felt like aggressive friendliness taken too far, but something about his body language and overly focused attention strictly on me, when there were plenty of other women around, started making my gut uneasy. I tried losing him in the crowd, deliberately taking a winding route through the store, but kept catching glimpses of him tailing me from a distance all the way to the checkout lines. My heart sank realizing this man had clearly zeroed in on me alone out of everyone there, and likely had no intention of leaving me in peace anytime soon. I quickly paid and briskly walked straight to my parked car, hoping he hadn't spotted where I was parked beforehand. Most of the drive home, I spent anxiously checking my rearview mirror, paranoid that I was being followed, but I saw no obvious signs of him or his car behind me on the lengthy route I took. Eventually, I started to convince myself I was just being paranoid and shook off the unsettled feeling. But that fragile sense of relief was completely shattered as soon as I pulled into my quiet residential street about 15 minutes later. Right away, I noticed a car idling oddly halfway up the block that immediately sped off down a side street as soon as my own vehicle approached. I only caught a brief glimpse of the driver as I passed by. My chest tightened like a vice. It was unmistakably the same man from Walmart who had been so eager for my attention and held back there. Somehow he had managed to track down where I lived and had waited there to continue his stalking. Thoroughly freaked out, I immediately drove right by my own house, too afraid to stop and linger in case he was still lurking nearby. I just kept driving somewhat aimlessly, keeping an eye out in all directions for any signs of him tailing me again, while I tried to figure out my options. I debated calling the police, but ultimately had no actual evidence, yet that this man had made any direct threats or clear harmful actions towards me. Eventually, after what felt like hours of taking a long, roundabout route through winding back roads, I worked up just enough courage to very cautiously loop back to my street once it seemed I had succeeded in losing any potential pursuers. My road appeared empty, dark, and still as I pulled slowly into my own driveway. My hands were shaking so badly from the leftover adrenaline, I could barely manage to unlock my front door once safely inside. I immediately rushed to triple check that each window and door was locked down tight and the curtains were fully drawn. I avoided turning on too many lights, somehow feeling exposed and visible even behind my own walls. Exhausted but too unsettled to sleep, I ended up calling a couple of close friends just to hear comforting human voices and assurances that I was now safe at home. But I still barely slept more than a few fitful hours that night, tossing and turning while imagining this unknown man who had fixated on me for reasons I could not fathom, lurking somewhere outside in the shadows watching my home. His demonstrated ability to successfully track my location and movements without detection all evening had deeply shaken me. What were his true underlying motives? How on earth had I seemingly caught his deeply disturbing attention and awakened this stalking obsession? And most terrifying of all, would he definitely be back for more? In the morning, I took an indirect random route constantly checking all around for any suspicious vehicles that seemed to be behind me. At first, the path stayed reassuringly clear, and I finally began to slightly relax the closer I got to the boutique retail shop where I worked. But then, just as I was parking and getting out of my car in the back lot, I happened to glance over and notice a vehicle parked at the far end of the street idling next to the curb that looked eerily familiar. I only glimpsed it for a split second before the driver abruptly pulled away and out of sight. But I was almost certain it was the same man from Walmart, somehow now staking out and waiting to observe me at my actual workplace too. I immediately told my manager what was happening once inside. She calmed me down and called the cops. I never saw that man again. What started out as just curious social media contact quickly morphed into a campaign of terrifying real-world surveillance and intimidation tactics by this unknown figure. It all began rather innocuously one evening. I noticed I had received a Facebook message out of the blue from an unfamiliar profile. The brief note itself seemed harmless enough at first glance. Just a young man casually paying me some compliments on my looks after he had apparently randomly stumbled across my page. While flattering attention from a total stranger online was admittedly a bit odd, nothing had seemed particularly alarming or dangerous yet. I sent him a short, polite reply simply saying thank you but making clear I wasn't interested in conversing further. I assumed that would be the end of the random, meaningless exchange altogether. But to my surprise and unease, the very next morning another message from him popped up in my inbox. This time, he made reference to a specific college graduation photo of mine that he had found, going on about how talented and accomplished I must be. Now feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I made sure not to respond at all this time, hoping to extinguish any flicker of encouragement for further communication. Unfortunately, my silence did little to dissuade him. Over the weeks that followed, his unprompted messages only increased in frequency, each one now mentioning some new personal detail, photo, or other fragments of my digital life that he was clearly digging deeper to uncover. He wove elaborate fantasies about how similar we were and how perfectly suited for one another we would be. Though his writings were initially framed as compliments, the tone gradually grew more possessively insistent about getting to actually know me better offline. I firmly told him his unsolicited contacts were completely unwanted, and that I would not hesitate to get law enforcement involved if he continued reaching out. But this polite warning only seemed to anger and provoke him further for some reason. The furious, vulgarity-laced messages full of ominous threats that followed my plea for him to stop terrified me far more than the earlier fawning ones. I immediately blocked his account, but the damage was already done. A few days later, as I was leaving work, I noticed an unfamiliar vehicle idling nearby that looked eerily similar to the one pictured in this man's Facebook profile. A knot formed in my stomach as I quickly snapped some discreet pictures of it for evidence before retreating back inside the building to reconsider my route home. All that week, the same car remained noticeably parked or circling nearby whenever I left the office. That weekend, as I attempted to go out normally with friends again, I recognized that increasingly familiar vehicle deliberately passing by wherever we went all evening long. My worst fears were confirmed. This unhinged stranger was no longer satisfied with only accessing me digitally from afar. He had now graduated to tracking me around in real life as well. But maddeningly, without crystal clear proof that he was the one driving, the police said there was little they could do beyond documenting sightings of the suspicious car in places I frequented. Just a few anxious days later, I arrived home to find a padded manila envelope sitting ominously on my doorstep. My hands trembled opening it to find printed photos of me going about mundane activities like eating at a cafe, shopping downtown, walking to my car after work, all clearly taken secretly from a distance over the past several weeks. The deeply invasive violation I felt realizing this predator had been cataloging my daily movements and whereabouts without my knowledge or consent made my skin crawl. But the police again could only file a report about harassment by mail unless he made overt threats. Soon, possible sightings of a strange man wearing a hat matching the one in the Facebook profile photo became more and more frequent wherever I went. His reflection would briefly appear in a store window behind me before vanishing when I tried approaching for a closer look. Random joggers and dog walkers wearing that same distinct hat seemed to conveniently cross my path, but quickly slip away before I passed by. No matter where I was, work, home, or out running errands, he always seemed to be lurking just out of reach, evading direct contact but watching my every move. I told the police in detail about these alarming new developments in person this time, providing all the evidence I had accumulated thus far. But infuriatingly, they reiterated that by their legal standards, no outright laws had technically been broken yet to justify intervening more proactively beyond taking reports. In their eyes, all of this still fell into a gray area of technically legal stalking and harassment they were powerless to stop. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.